You built an entire economic model on the Triffin dilemma from the 1960s, which was already thrown out by 1971 when the fundamental logic it relied upon disappeared under Nixon. Okay? So you're not crazy. These guys are idiots. Okay, so I was wrong. I think I was wrong. I've been hitting you with a number of economic pieces lately to hopefully give you a clinical, non-ideological perspective of Trump's economic strategy, to the extent that you can call it a strategy. And part of my central thesis has been that he's very much going it alone when it comes to this tariff agenda. And it tracks because there's only one thing that Donald Trump has stood for throughout his entire public career: that we have bad deals with other countries. No deep analysis, just that somehow we're getting ripped off. And his answer has constantly and consistently been tariff other nations to restore the balance of trade. So forget for a moment that this isn't necessarily how global trade works, because there's so much more to it. This is his one big idea, and it always has been. UNFTR. So we all just saw his historic Liberation Day tariff announcements and how he framed them as reciprocal. That was the phrase of the day, right? Reciprocal. Now, Trump's been saying for a long time that we're getting ripped off because we have trade deficits with several trading partners, most of whom are actually our best friends and our allies in the world. So basically, his problem is that we buy more from other countries than they buy from us. Okay, now understand that this is what he's calling their trade imbalance and as part of their tariff equation, and saying that it's not fair. But tariffs are not trade. Now, some countries have tariffs on certain products, but they're usually really, really specific. But the numbers that he trotted out were just bullshit. Now, we can talk about the math behind them another time. Just know that all he did was he took the trade differential between us and other countries and boiled it down to a percentage of the whole exchange and called it a tariff. That's not a tariff. Anyway, what he's trying to do is flip the trade imbalance to our favor. He wants other countries buying more of our shit. Okay, so to beat them into submission, his big idea is to tariff or tax the goods on the way into the country so they're more expensive to buy, which will raise money for the government in the short term, which he needs because he's liquidating the Treasury through massive tax cuts for the wealthy, which will increase prices in the United States. That's called inflation, until such time that we get our shit together to make all those things that we buy from other places here on U.S. soil. All we have to do is drop a tariff bomb on the world, the equivalent of rebooting a server. Trump is the equivalent of the annoyed IT guy who comes to your desk, reboots your computer and says, fixed it. So to even the playing field, because, we're an impoverished nation and the whole world is taking advantage of us, despite the fact that we're the largest economy in the history of the world. Literally wrote every single one of the trade agreements that we're operating under, possess the world's reserve currency, which makes the dollar the most valuable commodity on planet Earth, and our corporations help design these policies so they could open up manufacturing centers in parts of the world with cheap labor that don't have the benefit of union protections, all while maintaining offshore bank accounts to shelter these profits in tax havens. Damn it, we've had enough! No more! Anyway, back to my mea culpa. I thought this was his distorted view of the world alone. Largely because this kind of aggressive economic warfare that amounts to a global circular firing squad because we're all going to die as a result of it is too far-fetched for any rational policymaker to pursue. I've even been saying that there's no way that someone like Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary under Trump, would co-sign these maneuvers. No way. Boy, was I wrong. This is truly all part of the plan to, quote, reorder the world economy, in their words. So I'm going to kind of pop off a bit today and do an unfiltered rant to try and explain what it is that they're after, because it is fascinating. And I'm embarrassed to say, I didn't see it coming. By the way, our monthly member sticker packs are finally out and in the mail. So we've got the March Elon edition right here and the 420 inspired release right here. Some really fun stuff. And this is just a sneak peek of the kind of perks that you get here as a member at UNFTR. But if financial support isn't in the cards, don't worry. Tons of free benefits and ways to help. First, make sure you sign up for our free weekly newsletter that comes out every Saturday. It's the fastest growing progressive newsletter in the country. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel to help us take over the world as well. Hey, and if you're a coffee drinker like me, then you can also support us by purchasing our line of coffee manufactured in partnership with native coffee traders on the Puspatuk Reservation. Buying the coffee not only supports the show, but supports indigenous economic development on the reservation. Go to UNFTR for all the things. Now, back to how Trump is destroying planet Earth. Okay, so prior to World War II, the global economy was in complete and utter disarray. There's nothing today that's like comparable to the period before the Bretton Woods era, which started in 1944, which provided a working order to the global economy based on the US dollar as the reserve currency, but tethered to gold as the underlying valuation for it. So the TLDR is that prior to Bretton Woods, countries had to hold physical gold reserves to backstop their currencies, which was extremely limiting considering the seismic growth of the global economy due to heavy industrialization after the war. It also led to extreme imbalances between nations and wild shocks that crashed individual economies repeatedly from the mid-19th century forward. Now, there's a reason I'm bringing that era up, so I'll return to it in the conclusion, but for now, all we need to know is that the world economy was subject to crash after crash, culminating in 2 world wars and the Great Depression. So something had to change. Since World War II, there have been 2 distinct economic periods, both of which massively favored the United States. The first is the Bretton Woods era from 1944 to 1971, which relied on the aforementioned formula of the U.S. reserve currency, but tethered to the value of gold, not to the absolute amount of it. This was combined with security alliances among allied nations that entered into free trade agreements to encourage economic growth among them. Then we had this little bridge period of total chaos that began in the post-Bretton era in 1971 when Nixon pulled us from the quasi-gold valuation standard and allowed currency to float freely, the beginning of fiat currency. Nixon combined this maneuver with tariffs, similar to what Trump just enacted, but on a far more limited scale. We've never seen anything like what Trump just did. But this created a period of what we call stagflation in the 1970s, which we covered in our last video if you're interested in learning more about it. So this was a reset period of extreme economic shock and pain throughout the developed world because it coincided with 2 oil shocks in the 1970s that drove crude oil prices from $4 to $40 a barrel in under a decade. Now, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher then helped usher in the next economic era through something called the Plaza Accord. The Plaza Accord, signed in September of 1985 at the Plaza Hotel, where it gets its name, was an agreement among the G5 nations. So that's the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK, to intentionally weaken the US dollar relative to other major currencies, especially the Japanese yen and the German Deutschmark. Essentially, the goal was to devalue the dollar by strengthening currencies in Europe and Japan, which would make U.S. goods more competitive on the international market. So some of this might sound familiar in what Trump's kind of saying right now, but it's entirely different. So in conjunction with these currency devaluations, participating countries agreed to lower corporate taxes and reduce trade barriers to spur economic growth. And what followed was a boon to corporations in the alliance, and the U.S. and its allies went on to experience tremendous growth that outpaced the Soviet Union and China, helping solidify the new world economic order in our favor again. And yes, this is a formal example of currency manipulation, the very thing that we accuse everyone else of doing. Now, we can talk about the outcome for each nation another day and argue about whether it was a net positive or negative, who actually followed through on the agreements, and if it contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union as an example. And all of these are valid discussions and claims that have been made over the years. But the point here is to mark these 2 periods of time so we can contextualize what the Trump administration is trying to do. But first, let's introduce our 4 horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. The first one needs no introduction to our audience, at least. We did an episode on him a few months ago if you want to learn more about his sadistic plans for the country. Russell Vought head of the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, is credited as the primary author of Project 2025. And while many at the time claimed that it was just a glorified ideological think tank paper, I think now everyone can agree it was actually the GOP political platform. So nearly every policy prescription contained within Project 2025 has been undertaken with lightning speed by this administration. So everything from the massive DOGE layoffs and elimination of DEI programs to the shuttering of agencies like the Department of Ed, that was the brainchild of this asshole. Then there's Howard Lutnick, the new Commerce Secretary and chief ballwasher of the administration. Lutnick is a billionaire financier who was known as one of the most callous and ruthless figures on Wall Street as the head of Cantor Fitzgerald. And for a while, he was one of the most sympathetic figures in mainstream media because nearly all of his New York colleagues perished on 9/11. Now, at the time, it was devastating and he was all over the news, but eventually his reputation leaked out and people outside of Wall Street came to know that he was always considered an asshole and a pariah. That being said, he has a very transactional approach to business and trade, much in the vein of Trump's attitude, and believes in the doctrine of prosperity through strength.
I am telling you, the rules of the world are so stacked against us that we are just the consumer of the world, and it's going to end. And once that ends, and once America wakes up to it, and now all of America is going to wake up to it, that everybody is going to build their factories here.
In other words, I win, you lose. Then there's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, whom I hoped would be somewhat of an adult in this administration, but it turns out he's just as big of a dick. Just listen to his speeches or watch him in interviews and you'll immediately see that he's just a pompous, arrogant, and petulant Wall Street hedge fund prick.
We will re-leverage the private sector, and part of the key to re-leveraging the private sector is cutting regulation, making the tax policy permanent, and getting our regulated banking system going again.
He's a huge proponent of economic alliance zones that would divide the world into the same type of you're either with us or against us framework. And this is how Trump is dividing up nations in the tariff equation. But the guy I didn't see coming is Stephen Mirren. Ultimately, I think Bessent and Lutnick are hacks who are in it for the title and the power. I don't consider them true believers in the way that Russell Vogt actually wants to dismantle the U.S. economic and social orders to preserve white supremacy and do the bidding of the billionaire class. But Mirren appears to be a true believer when it comes to the world economic order that very much mirrors Vogt's domestic hierarchy.
U.S. consumers are flexible. We have options. We can produce stuff at home. We have a variety of countries we can import stuff. We can substitute into home production. Whereas countries that sell to the United States are inflexible. They've only got the United States to sell to. There's no alternative. So they're the ones who will bear the burden of these tariffs, which means that there's going to be very limited pass-through into downside economic risk or into higher prices. So I think that a lot of folks have got that wrong.
So as the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Mirren is very much in Trump's ear. And now I know why. This is the part that I missed. In November of 2024, he published a paper titled A User's Guide to Restructuring the Global Trading System, when he was with Hudson Bay Capital. It's basically Trump's wet dream, an economic policy analysis of tariffs and trades that support Trump's worldview. Reading this was like being in the back of the limousine with Tom Hagen and Don Corleone. So here I am the whole time thinking that Trump, as Tatalia, is the one behind it all. But it turns out it's Mirren as Barzini. And it was him all along. So Mirren's paper is the blueprint for Trump's Liberation Day tariff nonsense, under the belief that the thing that is supposedly holding the United States back from reclaiming the mantle of economic powerhouse and leading manufacturer of everything in the world is the imbalance of trade between us and the rest of the world. So in order to set the world right, we need to enter a new reset phase, similar to what happened under Nixon in the 70s, to get to a new era like Reagan and Thatcher did with the Plaza Accord, but better. So this is all intentional. Moreover, they seem to even understand that this could be as bad as the stagflation crisis in the 70s, but that it'll be worth it because what we get on the other side will be the new global economic order in our favor for the next 50 to 100 years. They know this will cause pain, and they're here for it. They're here for all of it. And they know that their logic is also extremely fucking thin. Here's Mirren in his own words. Quote, "There's a path by which these policies can be implemented without material adverse consequences, but it is narrow and will require currency offset for tariffs and either gradualism or coordination with allies or the Federal Reserve on the dollar. Potential for unwelcome economic and market volatility is substantial, but there are steps the administration can take to minimize it," end quote. Okay, so let's talk about that narrow path for a moment, shall we? Miron's whole thesis here is that we can weaken the dollar to spur manufacturing and export growth in the United States by implementing tariffs, and that we can do so without blowing up the global economy. All we have to do is coordinate with our allies, work with the Federal Reserve on the dollar, and do it gradually. And understand that this best case scenario is a view literally shared by no one. So the fact that none of the massaging that he mentions even occurred means that these guys are on another fucking planet by themselves. Now, if you want to get a little wonky for a minute, there's actually a theory that's underpinning all of these ideas. It's something called the Triffitt dilemma, named for an economist in the 60s who identified a tension faced by a country that serves as the world's reserve currency. So his idea is that in order to supply the US currency to the world, it has to run trade deficits, right? To give the money to other countries. There has to be a balance somewhere. So in doing so, that might undermine the value and therefore stability of the currency. So even if we take Triffitt's logic at face value, as Miron, Trump, and Bessent seem to have done, Triffitt's theory was based on the constraint of money under the Bretton Woods system. So once Nixon allowed the US dollar to float, that should have been the end of this theory, period. To build an entire tariff and trade theory around another theory that is itself rooted in a system that expired 50 fucking years ago should be enough to lock these guys up in economics prison. See, these guys believe that trade deficits somehow weaken the US economy, and that's what's holding us back. Holding us back from what? But this just isn't how modern international finance operates. See, what they're talking about ultimately is the dollar value and liquidity. We need a weak dollar to promote US exports, and the dollar itself needs to be stable and abundant to supply liquidity through the global economy. Fine. On the weak dollar idea, to benefit from this, you actually need a manufacturing base and a corresponding labor force. That's simply not the modern service and technology-based economy that we've spent the last 50 years building. And in terms of liquidity, you can generate liquidity in the modern era through more ways than trade deficits, like it was under Bretton Woods. I mean, there's credit lines, swaps, international settlement markets. All these things allow for the flow of goods and money around the world. Think about it. How does Iran still have stuff? How does Russia? How does China? They're all targets of US sanctions and tariffs, but they can still operate even if we're making life nearly impossible for them. Then there's the lunacy of Bessent's design that tiers our tariffs depending on who we like, who we don't like, and have trade deficits with, and so on. Even the island of just predominantly penguins, apparently, right? This represents a complete misunderstanding of global supply chains. Today's manufactured goods often cross borders multiple times before completion. Disrupting these chains through blunt tariffs creates inefficiencies that ultimately harm American consumers and businesses alike. It's just so fucking dumb. Just take Trump's tariffs of 2018 as an example. Studies of this period already show that American wholesalers and retailers bore much of the tariff burden through reduced profit margins. Not to mention, Chinese exporters got around this stuff by just rerouting goods through other countries. I mean, the research shows that rerouting increased by 50%. And one of the most concerning things is Lutnick and Miron's apparent dismissal of retaliatory risks. They believe the U.S. can win a trade war because we have the largest consumer market and capital strength. But history has shown that trading partners invariably respond with countermeasures that target politically sensitive American exports. And this tit-for-tat escalation spirals and creates uncertainty, dampens investment, and can lead to significant market volatility. Case in point, China responded immediately to the United States after the Liberation Day. The tariff war was a solution in search of a problem. Trump wanted this so bad because he thinks it gives him leverage. It's just a power move, pure and simple. So he chose the one guy who wrote a paper based on a disproven, outdated theory to create the plan, a plan that even Mirren, the author of it, said would have to be done gradually and with the help from basically everyone. I mean, there's a parable about camels and needles that feels appropriate here. Then he surrounded himself with unlikable, arrogant sycophants who respond to questions about this plan by acting like no one understands. But we do understand. You built an entire economic model on the Triffin dilemma from the 1960s, which was already thrown out by 1971 when the fundamental logic it relied upon disappeared under Nixon. Okay? So you're not crazy. These guys are idiots. Before we go, now that we've tackled the economic piece and the how behind all of this, let's talk about why. So what's the real motive here? I mean, Trump loves the stock market, and he's killing it. He won on the promise that he'd bring inflation under control, but he's knowingly increasing it. He's even saying that we're going to have to go through some pain, but on the other side, oh, it's going to be beautiful. But he's not even saying what that looks like. Well, I have thoughts. If you listen to the speeches of the four horsemen, and you read the materials that they produce, there are three objectives. The first is to reorder the world economy. This is the phrase that they use over and over. The second is to revitalize manufacturing in the United States. And the third is related to the second one, and perhaps the scariest: wartime preparedness. All right, so let's dismiss the reordering argument. I've covered this before, and some people even called bullshit on me, but I beg you to look this up. Pound for pound, we have been and remain the biggest, most powerful economy in the world, and it's not even close. So some of you have argued with this comparison in the past, so let me be clear. There are three standard measurements of GDP. GDP in absolute terms, meaning the sheer size of an economy, and on this the United States is the global leader far and away, and ahead of China, yes. Then there's GDP per capita, which just means how it relates to the size of the population. And again, we're orders of magnitude larger because our economy is bigger and we have fewer people. So more wealth among fewer people. And then there's the metric that people reference when they say China's overtaken the United States, and that's PPP, purchasing power parity. How robust an economy of a nation is relative to the people's ability to purchase things. And on this, they have us beat. Want to know why? Because they exploit their labor force. The government subsidizes vast swaths of the Chinese economy, and they redistribute wealth to poor areas of the country. So if you want to compete with China to reclaim the mantle of GDP PPP, then all you have to do is nationalize the energy system, nationalize the healthcare system, tax the fucking wealthy, and provide more money and benefits to poor states and suppress the wages of everyone in the country. So stop arguing with me about the sizes of economies. What matters most is the health and well-being of a nation's citizens. Because even though we have the most wealth on the planet, our other policies have made it so the wealth is accumulated by the top 1%. So Trump and the four horsemen want to reorder the global economy, even though we're already in first fucking place by a mile. No one comes close. So objective number one is built on really flawed logic, which brings us to objective number two, to bring back manufacturing in the United States. These guys think that by simply devaluing the dollar, they're going to magically make manufacturing great again. Well, a couple of points that I touched on briefly in the introduction in our last video. We're the ones who sent manufacturing elsewhere. It was a deliberate policy designed by corporate America and the US government in tandem. That's what Nixon's China policy was all about. That's why Carter doubled down on it, why Reagan pursued globalization, why Bush Sr. created NAFTA, and Clinton signed it. So in the last video, I explained how capitalism is designed to collapse in periodic cycles every 7 to 10 years, and I made it as non-ideological as possible. Even still, just for the sin of criticizing capitalism, somebody was like, "You're a socialist." Okay, so let me lean into that for a second. Rosa Luxemburg and Mikhail Bakunin, two of the great anarchist thinkers who came out of the socialist tradition, identified the flaws in Marx's logic and then Lenin by extension. Bakunin argued that revolutions needed to be guided by principles but not directed by organizations. Even if the intent of the organization was principally socialist, it would merely replace the existing structure with another authoritarian bureaucracy. And he was right. You cannot force a revolution. Luxemburg, for her part, criticized Lenin's revolution and Marx's belief that capitalism would ultimately give way to socialism through worker revolts because she understood the global and fungible nature of capital. So long as there's a part of the world where cheap labor can be exploited through force, capitalism would thrive. And she was right. Trump cannot simply manifest some sort of new capitalist revolution of another form. And U.S. corporations don't want to build manufacturing hubs in the United States because Americans are expensive and skilled. So long as cheap labor exists in areas that we can overpower and exploit, that's where the money in the manufacturing will go. Another flawed thesis on the part of the Trump team. Not to mention, it would take decades to rebuild what we've destroyed in the manufacturing sector over the past 40 years. This brings us to the final point, the scariest point. This idea that the ultimate reason to bring back the U.S. manufacturing sector is because we're somehow not war ready. Our military budget is still bigger than the next 10 economies combined. We have the capacity to nuke the world something like 5,000 times over. Who the fuck are these guys going to war with? Aliens? We spend $1 trillion a year on the military. What more do these guys want? Here's the thing. Over time, tariffs alone don't devalue the dollar. There's a whole host of things that have to happen to devalue a currency. But that's what they want to accomplish under this tariff regime. And if that were to magically happen, it also means that the purchasing power of every American declines. And because this decline is relative to other currencies, it means that anything imported or that contains components of imported goods is also more expensive. It means that the dollar doesn't go as far in other countries as well, so vacations get more expensive. It puts pressure on commodities like oil that settle in US dollars. So gas prices and home heating oil prices increase. It also makes US debt less attractive, which can lead to higher interest rates to compensate. And that means your home, auto, and credit card loans get more expensive. The only real benefit to a weak dollar is that it encourages tourism. But let me ask you something. Does it feel like we're giving off a hospitable vibe right about now? Does it sound like the United States is a fun place to visit? Does Universal Studios sound as fun as it used to? If there's a risk of getting your visa taken and being disappeared to Guantanamo, maybe we should send Mickey Mouse down to Cuba so he'd be like, "Welcome to Guantanamo, everybody." So that leaves the biggest question of all. Why take such a tremendous risk? Because it's not a risk to them. There were tycoons during the Depression. During the industrial age of the 19th century, the period that all four horsemen believe was the pinnacle of American industry and the peak of capitalism, when men were men, women didn't vote, and washrooms were for white people, wealthy industrialists thrived. If this is the downside to their tariff war, so fucking be it. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. There's literally no downside for billionaire elitists. They can afford to keep experimenting with our lives because we're completely expendable in their equation. Once again, I implore you, read your Dickens, read Jacob Riis. As for Trump, easy. There's another outcome that he wants specifically. A third term, or a forever presidency. So take his best case scenario, right? The long shot that everything works out in his favor and he truly reorders the global economic system, whatever the fuck that means, somehow defies the odds to set up the United States to be even bigger and more prosperous than it already is as the biggest, most prosperous economy. He will absolutely run for a third term. But take the more likely scenario, that he burns this economy to the ground. Forced austerity for the masses, high unemployment, high inflation, markets rocked. If everything falls apart, who do you think he'll blame? I have no idea. But I can tell you this much, it won't be himself. But it will lead to civil unrest. And he's already said out loud he will enlist red state National Guards to put down any uprisings. He's already invoked the Alien Enemies Act to disappear people. Now think about the leaders that he admires the most. His words, not mine.
Viktor Orban, one of the most respected men. They call him a strong man. He's a tough person, smart, Prime Minister of Hungary. But I want to thank the President of El Salvador because he's done an amazing job. You saw it. Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart, to which I was greeted with, oh, that's such a terrible thing to say.
He loves these three. He loves Putin, Bukele, and Orban in particular because they did something very important in his mind. They suspended or manipulated their own constitutions to retain power. Putin, Bukele, Orban all took fragile democratic states and bent them to ensure they could extend their power. And they did it all under the guise of crisis because that's what dictators do. Things are so bad, only I can save them, even if I made them this way. See, either way, he wins. Either way, he stays. That's what's in his head. And why the Trumpocalypse or Trumpageddon, whatever you want to call this economic plan, is a win-win situation for him. Here endeth the lesson. You know all that fun membership stuff that I was talking about before? You know who took advantage of that stuff? These people.
This is the story of a political pundit who looked at the world around him and just said, fuck it. Gives the middle finger to authority and says, kiss my ass. But instead of a revolution, he started a podcast. Just what the world needs. Started a podcast. Another basic white guy who started a podcast. But it's fun because he curses all through the podcast.